All right, good morning and good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're tuning in. Welcome to the August SDEC session. As we give everybody a chance to join, we've launched a poll to gauge everybody's current knowledge of today's topic, CDPs. So please make sure to submit your answer and we'll be checking those here shortly. My name is Julia Petrie from Search Discovery, and if you're a returning user, a returning SDEC member, welcome back. And if this is your first time, we're glad to have you here. So as a quick background, the SDEC, we're a community that offer webinars on various topics like digital strategy, CDPs, data strategy, and so many more. In the chat, I'll be sending some links that include a link to our online video library of all of our past webinars, a link to join our email list so you can get all of the latest webinar updates, and finally, a link to RSVP to our upcoming webinar on September 19th. During today's session, if you have any questions for our speaker today, please make sure to place those in the Q&A section of Zoom, and we'll make sure to get to those at the end. And for anybody who's joining us just now, we have launched a poll and would love your participation. We'll be revealing those answers shortly. So finally, I'm excited to introduce our guest speaker today, Glenn van der Linden. He is the co-founder and lead solutions architect for Human 37, a customer data strategy agency. So with that, I will turn it over to Glenn to dig into the components of a CDP.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Julia. Perfect pronunciation of my name. Thanks for that, by the way.
Yes.
Like you said, I'm the co-founder of Human 37. We do customer data strategy, including CDPs, data warehouses, everything that touches analytics and marketing or business use cases. For me, it's actually afternoon, it's 4 p.m. I'm based in Brussels, Belgium. My role day-to-day, operationally speaking, at the agency is basically solution architecting, making sure that all of the problems disappear as fast as possible for our clients, and that the use cases go in production, and that we can build better experiences for customers using their data. When I'm not working, I try to read some books, climb a wall, or pitch my tent somewhere outdoors, anything I can do to get away from screens. Trivia. What we're going to do today is we're going to have a short conversation. I think we have 45 minutes, of which like 15 minutes are foreseen for Q&A, to have a look at the anatomy of a CDP, package CDPs to be specific, and then we'll move into alternative approaches to package CDPs. Have a short conversation on what should you take into account on making choices about CDPs and when to choose which route. And then the question is, like, from an industry perspective, where does it go from there? Let's start with the anatomy of a CDP. And the thing is, if we want to talk about why we need to understand what a CDP is, or maybe for some people, they might think it's annoying to over-define what it is and what it is not. I agree. But there's a very specific reason why we have that conversation, right? Everybody who has been in this digital space, marketing analytics, or anything that has to do with like data collection, measurement, all of these type of things, for a couple of years know that the industry quite has changed a bit. A couple of years back, it was still the Wild West. We could do whatever we want. Trackers were everywhere and data was just pouring in. These days, the world is a bit different. And for good, actually, it's better like this, I believe. Consumers are more aware of data collection, about what data is being harvested, why it should be harvested, and companies are urged to be more responsible. And tech vendors actually are, to some extent, going along with that. We see Apple providing very strong security safeguards. We see browsers doing the same. And as a result, people in the industry have been bombarded with the term like cookie apocalypse and the death of third-party cookies. Everybody had nightmares about those terms. And it's obviously not the only things that drive the question about CDPs or the demand for CDPs, but it's one of them. Why? Because as a result, the second narrative that everybody has been brainwashed with is that you should start harvesting or collecting first-party data. And this is exactly the problem and the solution, or the antidote, let's say, that CDPs have positioned themselves in. Everybody who struggles with use cases around measurement, attribution, all these type of things, and beyond, by the way, and have been looking into data collection from a first-party perspective, they typically go and look at a customer data platform, or at least customer data platforms make sure that they position on those solutions. Now, what do customer data platforms actually solve, or what are the problems, the pains that they address? These are a couple of user stories that we actually actively have worked on with some of our clients and that you might recognize. Typically for marketing people, it's around attribution. If third-party cookies don't work, or if you lose tracking or data points along the way because of other elements in the wild, let's say, you're trying to look for alternatives. Attribution and measurements via server-side tracking or any of these components is one of these alternatives. Customer data platforms and a collection of first-party data actually resolve a couple of these elements. So everybody who's using Facebook CAPI, Conversion API, or offline conversion in Google Ads might be familiar. Everything that has to do with regards of budget optimization or increasing ROI to make sure that you don't target the people who should not be targeted or the people who already have purchased, so negative audiences, also a use case for first-party data. And in general, everything that has to do with customer experience, right? I would like to understand the number of complaints a customer logged before reaching out. This is our very, let's say, first non-marketing use case, but it contributes to customer experience. So CDPs also position on that field. And then, not to be forgotten, everything that has to do with privacy and data governance. I'm from Brussels, so it basically means that GDPR is king where I am active, which also means that I have a couple of responsibilities, or at least a lot of our clients have responsibilities towards their customers. So data subject access requests, the need to be able to figure out which data points are collected for a single user, and so they can be deleted in all of the destination systems is one of these functionalities, or the pains that customer data platforms address. So now we have a bunch of marketeers, a bunch of business people, a bunch of people who are in general busy with customer experience, legal, etc., trying to figure out in this new world, we have first-party data, we need to collect it, we need to unify it, we need to be able to deal with it. And here are the CDPs that position them exactly in this field. Good, so you have a huge amount of RFPs going out, and the title of them is all request for proposition or proposition for customer data platforms. So now the next step begins. So welcome to the customer data platform jungle. This is a screenshot from the CDP Institute, which is founded by David Raab. He's basically one of the first people who coined the term customer data platform, and he's been keeping track of the industry in general. This is a screenshot from July 2023, and it counts 177 ready to go to market CDPs in their inventory or qualified according to the CDP Institute. The CDP Institute kind of uses very specific terms to classify CDPs, which is, I believe, kind of a good thing to at least have some sort of measurement. But if you kind of start blurring these lines, you can easily add tens and tens and tens on top of them. So as you can tell, it's not really easy to figure out like, okay, I need a CDP. You got that first, you got that right. Or at least I have problems that a CDP could solve. Let's start with that. Now I'm going to market with an RFP or with some sort of a questionnaire to figure out, I need a CDP who can help me. And all of a sudden you're facing 177 vendors. You could think it's good, but there's always a downside, and that is that not all CDPs are created equal, right? Like every market that is growing, and the CDP market is a multi-billion-dollar market, every vendor wants to get a piece of the pie, which basically also means a lot of vendors are positioning themselves on acronyms that they aren't necessarily fulfilling all of the features from, right? We have ESPs moving into the CDP space, we have CRMs moving into the CDP space, and we have the original CDPs who were there on day one of the CDP markets, right? Depending on your use case, you might want to know which features you want, which features you don't, and what it actually means for you to have the CDP that you're requiring for your use cases. And that's why together with Arpit, and I hope I pronounced his name correctly, Arpit Chudhuri, very difficult for me. We wrote this guide on the Composable CDP versus the Package CDP, not to make a distinct difference, but actually to bring a conversation around what are the components a CDP could be consisting of, and what should you be looking into, or what are the specific components you might want to ask a vendor while you're doing an RFP or you're investigating the market around CDPs that you might want to be aware of to make sure that they're part of the package that are being offered. So you make sure that you buy the CDP that works for you and that you don't end up with a solution that has the acronym CDP, but actually doesn't fulfill all of the use cases because assumptions were made and everybody went along with it. I'm not going to go over the entire article. We're going to highlight 3 or 4 components because we need them later on. But basically, the customer data platform contains a bunch of elements at the moment, at least, like we defined when the article was written in March of this year. Data storage, identity resolution, profile APIs, visual audience builder, reverse ETL, data quality, governance and compliance, ETL or ELT, and CDI. We're going to zoom in on 4 of them because we need them later on. The rest you can actually find in the article, and we'll provide the links after this session. What does it mean to be a package CDP? And we start with package CDPs because customer data platforms, when the market started, everything was a package CDP, right? What we're now seeing is the unbundling of CDPs or composing CDPs, which means that some vendors have some features, others have not. But more than ever, the term CDP is being used when they go to market. And that doesn't mean the same thing, right? If you're going to a vendor that positions as a composable CDP or a CDP coming from an ESP, or an engagement platform, the feature that they might have in their consideration of a customer data platform might be different than the ones from a purely packaged CDP. None of the approaches are wrong, and the objective is not for me to tell you today that this is right or this is wrong. The objective is to share what we believe from experience and from pure opinion, what we think CDPs might be and might not be, so you can actually use us as an input in order to form your own opinions. So what does it mean to be a package CDP? A package CDP is an all-in-one productized solution, very important, with capabilities to collect and store data from multiple sources. We'll come back to that later. Transform and unify the data, resolve identities, build audiences in a non-technical way, preferably, and sync to downstream destinations, right? These are typically the things that you know. If you're a bit into CDPs or familiar with the CDP market, these are the things that are pretty obvious. Obviously, some package CDPs will also offer tools to define data quality rules, data governance protocols, and comply with privacy regulations. You see, it's quite a bunch, right? You can almost tell that it's like a package CDP is a suite of features that make sure that everything with regards to customer data is safeguarded in one productized solution. And the advantage of a productized solution is, I don't know how big your organizations are today, but that you only have to go through procurement once. This is one of the positioning points of a package CDP. We're going to zoom in, I believe, 3 to 4 points. What does it mean, behavioral SDKs and data collections? CDI and customer data infrastructure, it basically means that we're able to collect data from online assets. Think of mobile applications, think of websites, think of anything that you're familiar with. If you come from marketing, from Google Analytics, GA4. If you're more into analytics purely, you might think about Snowplow. If you're thinking about product, you might want to think about Amplitude and Mixpanel, right? These tools have SDKs. They're not CDPs, but this is what you have when we talk about behavioral SDKs. It's basically that type of data collection. SDKs being implemented in one of your assets and data is being captured. There's also this concept of ETL or extract, transform, and load, where we basically can sit on top of an existing application and extract data from there. Think of lifecycle events from, for instance, customer IO or any of your ESPs or push notification platforms. Did users engage? Was there a call? Did a status in my CRM change? And that data would be sucked into the customer data platform in order to be then in the next step unified. Data governance. Data quality is for a lot of people, boring topic. It's one of my favorites. I'm guilty, sorry. Because I believe that garbage in is garbage out, especially when it comes to customer data, and especially when you start distributing at scale. You can collect the data points wrong once, but then distribute it almost endlessly, right? So data quality are basically, I usually compare it to border controls. If you don't have the right paperwork to get in, well, basically data quality safeguard will make sure that you don't enter the system. Next, you have privacy and governance, meaning that, well, at least in Europe, and I believe in other parts of the world as well, there's Australia has legislation, the US has a couple, I believe they're state-based even. Brazil has a legislation when it comes to data privacy, but it also means that customers or organizations collecting customer data have responsibilities towards their customers to make sure that they can get rid of the data or answer any questions about data collection in a very centralized, legal, and automated way. Customer data platforms, in some cases, can provide these. And then we come to a very interesting point, identity resolution and a profile API. Identity resolution is one of the notorious hard subjects for everybody working with data. If you go talk to data engineers, it probably is the thing that gives them headaches. But basically, identity resolution is the process of figuring out which user is matching with which identity. Today, I'm Glenn van der Linden. My email is glenn@human37.com. My phone number would be XYZ, and my private email would be 1234@gmail.com, right? I am the same person. The ability to be able to unify these profiles is a very hard task, and customer data platforms actually take, to a large extent, the heavy lifting out of your hands. You don't have to build anything, but basically you pay for them to solve that thing. And so a lot of the customer data platforms actually have identity resolution engines in there with baked in what we call profile APIs. And profile APIs allow you to, from an outside source, programmatically query identities of users and get a response. Very handy if you want to do website personalization based on login credentials, for instance. And then we have everything that is audience builders. Audience builders are usually a non-technical way to build audiences. And we'll come back in detail a bit later on that point. But what it means is that people with zero technical knowledge have a UI where they can click and drop and say, show me all the users who have started onboarding step 3, but did not finalize to step 4, and build an audience from there and actually send them or send that audience to a downstream destination and do something with it. Send them a push notification, send them an email, send them a advertisement in order to make sure that they complete their application. Now, if you represent this visually, you kind of get like this spaghetti thingy that moves from left, and in the center, everything gets centralized, which represents unification, right? And then on the right hand, the spaghetti just continues. And it's very funny because if I'm not mistaken, the screenshots I took, the bottom is segment, the top is particle, and the right is rudder stack. So customer data platforms from a package point of view kind of represent themselves in a very similar way, right? So that's what you get usually when we talk about package CDPs and the components that are part of a fairly standard package CDP. Now, what are alternative approaches to buying a package CDP, right? Because not everybody wants to buy a package CDP. There's this whole movement of the Composable CDP. And a Composable CDP is basically a set of integrated tools that are assembled using open source or proprietary software to perform some or all of the functions of a package CDP. Well, you have the package CDP. Within package CDPs, you have a bunch of components or a bunch of elements, like we call the anatomy of a full-fledged CDP. Some CDPs, or the best CDPs, have all of them. Some CDPs have some of them, and they would still be a package CDP, right? Because you buy a couple of features in a packaged license. And then you have the composable custom data platform, which basically means that either I'm going to build a set of components, or I'm going to go out and shop for every individual piece. And if we think about the snake image that we've shown in the past, a couple of slides, it actually means that we would go out and either buy or build data governance ourselves, buy or build a data unification engine, buy or build the integration for downstream destinations. And it would kind of look like something like this, right? Usually, composable CDPs are also built around the data warehouse. And that's why you see on the blue block, I'm not sure if the contrast is perfect, but the blue block kind of represents a very simplified representation of what the customer data warehouse does. And around that, you see a couple of elements that like make up this composable customer data platform. And it's if you go back a couple of slides, it's very similar to what's going on here, right? Except you're identifying all of the elements and you're trying to build it yourself. So from the left-hand side, you have data flowing in. You ETL it, or you have a behavioral SDK, so drawing details. Comes in the landing zone, you go through unification process, you get into structured tables that are fit for purpose, and you move that out in an audience form or in raw data form. Now, from experience, we've encountered a couple of challenges, and they're not, it's not like they're problematic, right? It's not impossible to resolve, but there are challenges with it, which you should know. When you start building out your own composable CDP. And there's mainly 3 of them. 1, the behavioral data, 2, the unification, and 3, audience building or reverse ETL. Let's start with challenges with the behavioral SDK. Well, if you require behavioral data, you're basically going to make sure that you forge it, or you build an SDK, or you figure out how to get the data to the customer data warehouse, right? The narrative today about composable CDPs is that all of the data is in the data warehouse anyways. In some cases, that's correct. In many cases, that is not correct, right? And so you need to figure out how are we going to plug that gap that we have if you want to build a composable CDP in our infrastructure. If you want to build it yourself, you're going to be probably in for quite an ordeal, because it means that depending on what your ecosystem looks like, you might want to develop SDKs for your applications, and SDKs for your applications need to be able to handle different languages like Kotlin or like Swift. They need to be handling difficult things like retries, caching, automated responses of success that the data package was received, etc. So you're in for quite a journey, and it also means that you need to go with all of the updates that these languages provide, or that, for instance, iOS forces on you. It doesn't mean it's a dead end, right? Can you outsource the behavioral data collection piece of your composable CDP? And the answer is yes. You could go to CDP vendors and just use their SDKs. You could actually also use product analytics tools like Amplitude or Mixpanel and use their SDKs, move it to their platform, and then from there, use data pipelines in order to move it into the data warehouse that you're building on. There's also solutions like RudderStack, which are basically very focused on SDKs. And then there's also alternatives like GA4's SDK to integrate with BigQuery if that's your thing, or the mother of all data warehouse first SDKs, let's say, would be Snowplow that you can use in order to get that behavioral data, also validate it, which is nice. We didn't talk about it here because I didn't want to go too much in the topic, but actually make sure that you have a behavioral data stream for your data warehouse and your composable CDP as yourself. Now, the second main challenge is building unification yourself. The challenge of unification is one that actually, depending on your setup, starts off easy. The less identifiers you have, the easier it is to manage identities. But every time you hook up a new source and you ingest a new piece of data, there's a potential that there's a new identifier coming in, right? Imagine we have 0 behavioral data, but all of a sudden we're hooking up a behavioral SDK. That behavioral SDK will be spinning up an anonymous ID of some sort. It means that all of a sudden, in our identity resolution logic, we need to account for an additional identifier. And so it scales, the complexity scales. On top, data quality challenges, like I said, garbage in, garbage out, make things very hard. Everywhere where there's manual input, people make mistakes, and it means that your identity resolution engine basically could break. Obviously, everything works stronger if there's single sign-on, and profile merge policies need to be put in place in order to be able to figure out if there's a clash. Typically, when people use the same devices, or when there are anomalies in their usage, or edge cases where people log in using same accounts, or when families or businesses are put together in group accounts. And those are notoriously hard to handle purely in SQL. So those are things that you need to take into account. Fuzzy matching is one of these things that people like, but that we see causing in a lot of cases more issues than they actually resolve. So deterministic matching usually we see performs better than fuzzy matching. Now, an example of something going wrong. So we tried building our own unification engine with a bunch of identifiers. And what you see on the left-hand side is an over-merged profile. This is actually something from production. And this is a cluster, I don't know how many identities are linked, but it's a massive amount of identifiers poured together. And the center nodes of all of this is a single sign-on ID called 0. And we figured out later on that this was a test ID. So all of the people were using different devices, etc., all over the world in the company, and they were all using that test ID, meaning that everything got clustered around that user and building this understanding that we have one user consisting of multiple identifiers, merging a huge amount of data, creating this very weird customer profile and very weird behavior. But in the end, this was an over-merging policy. So you need to build in safeguards in order to be able to handle that. When we tear them apart, you basically get clusters of the size that we see on the right-hand side, which basically give you an idea of what a real cluster would look like. Can you outsource identity resolution? Obviously you can. More and more you could buy standalone solutions. You could just use Segment or InParticle or any package CDP and actually use only the identity resolution piece. But more and more what we see is that there's standalone solutions going to market. Examples are Zing.ai, Trualty, and even HighTouch recently released Identity Merge on top of the data warehouse, which you basically can buy and help and leverage in order to build identity resolution on top of your existing data set rather than trying to go through a bunch of hoops and headaches in order to build it yourself like originally we tried. Now, the next step is getting that data out of there, right? You have a bunch of destinations, all of your data, in this case, in the composable CDP, is sitting on top of your data warehouse. How do we get it out of there? Question is, can I build reverse ETL myself? If you have a lot of engineering power, you have a lot of time, and you enjoy these type of things, you obviously can. But this is basically a list of all the things you need to take into account. This is an example for a GCP setup. The downside is that you don't have a visual audience builder, which basically means that everything is more or less stored as code. So every time you want to build a new audience, you'll need to go in and write a bunch of scripts in order to get that in production and have a new work stream that takes care of that. It's a non-user-friendly way to do it, and it's an engineering first, meaning that every small adaptation will require engineering resources, and these are notoriously hard to get in every organization, and usually not the cheapest if you need to figure out where to get them elsewhere. Can you outsource them? Obviously you can, and I see the title is wrong here, but can you outsource reverse ETL? You obviously can. And there are solutions like high-touch sensors and weld, which basically sit on top of your warehouse, grab the data, you can build a model, and then shoot the data to any of your destination of your liking. You could do Facebook Conversion API that way. You could fulfill some of the fields in your customer IO setup or in your iterable setup. You could send data to your customer support platform, all of these type of things straight from the data warehouse. The interesting part is that most of these solutions, if not all of them these days, also offer the visual audience builder, which basically means that once the data is configured and your reverse ETL tool sits on top of your data warehouse, marketeers with zero SQL or technical knowledge can actually come in and drag and drop criteria to build up audiences and ship the data to a destination. Same for personalization APIs, which would require you or which would enable you to do on-site personalization for users as well. Now, the question is always when to choose what, and there's like this massive debate going on LinkedIn, which setup is the best. We also wrote an article or an opinion on that piece, because obviously the first article triggers the second one. But there's a bunch of questions that you could ask yourself. And there is, again, no right or wrong answer. I think depending on what you answer on these questions, you will figure out which setup works best for you. Even you could go for a package CDP to a partially packaged CDP or to a composable CDP or anything in between, right? First question is use case, use case, use case. What is my use case? For a lot of marketing use cases, I would say, and I'm thinking top of mind, conversion API, offline conversions for Google Ads. Basically, yes, that data is in the data warehouse, and with a single reverse ETL setup, you could actually stream that data to your destination. More complex setups, like I would like to have behavioral data, but I don't have a behavioral SDK, and I want to merge it with something else, meaning we have two identifiers, might require a more complex setup. And at that point, the question is, will I build it or will I buy it? Important is to look at what my use cases are, think ahead, and let's say 6 to 12 months, and then figure out like what are the requirements that I have. Always take use cases first and not the popularity of brands or the stuff you would like to test, because that's basically what causes problems. One infrastructure can also be chosen in like the midterm to evolve in the long term, right? Usually what we see is that very simple use cases unlock the way for more elaborate use cases. And at that point, the infrastructure needs to evolve, and you might want to either build or buy more components or go with a more integrated setup. Question is also, what's the speed to market required, right? There's an argument that says that composable CDPs have a faster or shorter term to value or time to value, but everything depends. The data should be available. Like I said, if you have behavioral data and you don't have it in the data warehouse, you're kind of stuck because you still need to go through that development. But when short-term ROI is key, we actually see that it works very well. We take a piece of data from the data warehouse, we sync it, the use case validation is made, and it opens doors for more use cases. On the other hand, we've also seen and conducted very successful package CDP implementations that don't happen in a single go with a simple use case by use case approach and actually look at the same thing. At that point, usually what we see is that the use cases are driven more around the addition of behavioral data, merging it with something else. Identity resolution is a key part of the use case, and then enabling a bunch of use cases in the end. It doesn't mean that we need 6 months of deployment. It could mean that we need a couple of weeks of deployment or a couple of days of deployment in order to get that first data points on your SDK instrumented, actually grab the data, unify it, and then everything goes on its own. Integration friction, and that's one important remark I've highlighted, but I almost forgot it. Integration friction is almost reduced to zero compared to composed solutions. And when I say integration friction, I'm actually not referring to implementation friction. I'm actually referring to the integration friction in a composable setup, meaning that you still need to take care of the integration between different components in a composable setup yourself, right? If you buy a package CDP, well, you basically buy an off-the-shelf product that's integrated from A to B, or from A to Z, actually. And all these elements are in there and they work seamlessly. You don't have to figure out how to integrate data quality with your data pipeline or with your identity resolution and your reverse ETL setup. There's also this belief that people are builders in some organizations, which is absolutely fine and they make amazing products. But in a lot of organizations that are very centered around UX and customer data, from day one, we see that they've built a lot of their infrastructure themselves. And then the question is, if I want to build a customer data infrastructure based on the use cases I have, and I have identified which pieces I actually need, how much do I have left? What should I still get? Does it make sense for me to buy the entire package CDP, or are there only a couple of components that I need? And typically when organizations are builders and they're, let's say, customer data focused or digital first, they kind of have a large infrastructure already. And those organizations prefer to build, and then they either decide to, well, I need a data governance component, or I need a visual audience builder with the reverse ETL setup. And then they would go out and either build it themselves or pick it as a standalone solution and integrate it. Do you have a team? One of the main arguments that we see in these philosophies, on one versus the other, and one is better than the other, is usually like, okay, but the data is already there. We talked about it in a couple of previous slides. That's not always the case. And the second argument, usually it's cheaper. I don't necessarily believe it's cheaper. I think it's an allocation of budget. Either you don't hire the people to build and integrate it, and you buy an off-the-shelf solution, or you hire the people to build and integrate it yourself. And at that point, you're actually replacing licenses with manpower, right? And data engineers in general, or developers in general, which is kind of the combo that you would need, are expensive profiles. So also take that into account, and not only license costs of product A versus product B. Now, the big question is, and this is my last slide, where do we go from here? There's this fierce battle going on that is quite entertaining. I do recommend you to read through a couple of these elements. They're enriching when it comes to your understanding of how products are built and how software is built and how organizations are actually building their infrastructure. I don't believe there is a good or a bad answer. I do believe that there's an answer that is better for some types of organizations versus others. How the industry as a whole will evolve, well, time will tell, right? Originally, everything was a package CDP. Now we see composable CDPs on the rise with pinpoint solutions. The question is it scalable? Is it secure? Can you integrate it properly? And so one of the beliefs is that more and more organizations will run on hybrid CDPs, or even that some of the package CDPs will unlock some of their features or their components as standalone in order to be integrated. There's a very interesting article on the future of CDPs, packaged and composable, written by Michael Katz. Obviously, he's kind of biased because he's the founder of mParticle. On the other hand, it does explain well a couple of concepts like security in software, etc., that are worth skimming through. And obviously, like Aaron said in this post on LinkedIn, sometimes a debate is a non-debate, right? Composable CDPs, what he says in this post, are built to make sure that customer data gets moved through, while the argument of some vendors is that it's a highly inflexible schema or data model. But in the end, you don't need all of these data points to be moved to a destination if the destination can't handle it. So I'm very excited actually to see how this will evolve over time. I'm expecting a lot of vendors to actually buff up their game and come with like inventive solutions and more value for customers. But what I'm most excited about is that we're actually talking about doing something with the customer data that we've been collecting for years on end without actually doing something with it in most cases. And that we're actually now being able to have a conversation around the value of customer data and what it means to have data for the customer whose data it is in the end. Thank you. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts.
Awesome. Yeah, so we will open it up for questions, and I have just ended the poll and I am sharing the results. It looks like we have some that are familiar, actively considering it. So to kick off the questions, what would somebody who is somewhat familiar or actively considering a CDP, what would be a big call out that they might need to incorporate this into their business strategy?
I think like to incorporate in their business strategy, make sure that you have an owner. We see a lot of use cases where, and I hate the word digital transformation. I absolutely hate it, but it's a word that people know, so I'll use it. What we see is that digital transformation usually is in the form of slides and top down. What we usually see when we deploy a customer data platform is that the organization is forced to change, because all of a sudden there's this guy in product or marketing who purchased a customer data platform, and he or she is sitting on top of all of the data gathered by or generated by customers. And it means that they touch upon customer support data, email platform data, behavioral data, ticketing data, all of these type of things. And so all of a sudden, all these teams are involved, legal is involved, and everybody starts looking at that person or that platform in order to figure out like, okay, it's interesting because all of a sudden the customer is again in the middle. So I would be aware that that could happen, and it's actually a good scenario, right? Because the whole organization then would be focusing around the customer, but it also means that at least one person and ideally a team would be carrying that responsibility to make sure that everybody is involved and that the stakeholders actually know what's going on.
All right, and I'm seeing a few more questions come in. Let's see. Amy, she is asking, are there parameters where scale or repeat activity from consumers need to be met before a CDP makes sense?
Like for a car purchase or mortgage that only happens every several years. Yeah, it's a fair point. Consultant answer, sorry for that, it depends. The reason why I'm saying that is depends on what you're measuring, right? If you're only gonna measure the transaction, I would say it doesn't really make sense. If you are a bank that is dispatching mortgages for cars, for instance, you'll probably have a bunch of other activities. That person is also, or that customer is also receiving emails. You're trying to upsell them. You're trying to figure out what are the moments of truth in their life or the milestones in their life and how you can help as a financial institution. I'm not familiar enough with the automotive industry and what they're doing today, but I assume that there's applications and stuff that you want to keep track of how users are engaging with your brand and how familiar they are, and making sure that they go to how do you call it, revisions and make sure that the car is okay every X amount of miles and those type of things. So it's not only about the purchase transactions, it's also about what are the use cases you have that contain the rest of these interactions you have with your customers. If that's not on your agenda, then probably a customer data platform is not what you're looking for. That's correct.
All right, we got another one from Alex. How can your client measure the return on their investment in a packaged CDP, and how long on average does it take to add value?
How can you measure return on investments? The way we do it is we start with use cases. I'm going to be very annoying with that, and it's what I do or what we do in general with most of our clients. We're a pain in the ass when it comes to use cases. Why? Because customers come in and they say, I want a customer 360-degree view of my clients. Okay, great. It's going to cost you a ton of money, and the return on investment is going to be zero because you're not going to do with it. That's your use case, right? And so we push them really hard to figure out like, okay, but once you have that data, what are you going to do with it? Very simple example. I would like to measure, I'm going to take a marketing example just because it's easy. I would like to get my transactional data from my CRM system, and I want to move it to Facebook copy for ad measurements, right? Those are things that are user stories at a very tiny operational scale where you can say, okay, based on this user story, I would assume an uplift of 10% in my ROI or my visible ROI because I can add that measurement point, right? So I can show to the board, well, this system is actually providing us more visibility on what we're doing and the impact. And that's an ROI piece. Same that we did for one of our clients where we had an abandoned basket email running through a customer data setup where the ROI was 10 times as high as they invested in order to get there because they were all of a sudden enabled to get the data from one source, figure out who that user was, build an audience from it, and dispatch that audience to multiple channels, right? So if you have these type of use cases, it would work in terms of putting ROI on it. Usually we start with marketing use cases for a couple of reasons. Marketing is fairly detached from the business. It means we don't need to touch upon a lot of operational systems. We don't need to go fidget with IT or flip around operational processes. And usually they spend money and they look at how much they get back, right? So in terms of KPIs, it's fairly easy to set KPIs there. Once we have the buy-in or once we have an understanding of, well, this is uplifting ROI, we can start working on more complex use cases. And in a lot of cases, it's also opportunity cost. I spent less time on something and that equals to this amount of money that we've spent. I hope kind of answering the question that way.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. All right, we have one from Chris. When it comes to buy versus build, what is the typical cost or perhaps number of dev hours to implement your own CDP? Which capabilities, such as identity resolution, take the most effort to build in-house and are therefore recommended to buy?
Consultant answered, sorry, it depends. Everything depends on the setup you have, right? Identity resolution is notoriously hard if you have multiple identifiers. If you have only two identifiers because you're ingesting an email and a user ID and you can easily match them because you only have two inputs, at that point, it's not going to be hard and you can build it yourself, right? So everything depends on what the state of your, because I assume in this case, you want to build a composable CDP around the data warehouse, what the state of your data quality is in there, how many identifiers you have, how many sources you're ingesting, and how many destinations you're going to ship that data to. And it's kind of a factor. The more sources you add at a later stage, you also need to update your identity resolution engine, right? What you're seeing here is that once you buy, you're not done. There's a whole maintenance stage, upgrade stage, monitoring stage that you need to be aware of that also will tie up resources for a long time or a full time actually for a percentage of their capacity. 100 engineers could be busy or 10 engineers could be busy 100% of the time building it, but afterwards you still need X amount of engineers monitoring, updating all of these things, right? So that's also an investment. In terms of development, it all depends on what your use cases are as well. I've seen customer data platforms go live in a matter of a couple of weeks, integrating the entire SDK, tracking applications, getting behavioral data, mapping it with their CRM, doing use cases for marketing and operations, while others take 6 months. And I think that just depends on the business, not necessarily the technology or the way you approach the problem. To answer the question on will the presentation be available, I will make sure that the presentation is available, yes.
Yes, the presentation will be available, and I'll also send out the link to the recording as well. And Glenn, I think you did mention there is a link to an article that you'd be able to share as well.
I'll make sure that I'll send that to you, Julia, and then that way everybody gets it.
Perfect. Yes.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, looks like that's all of our questions for today. Glenn, I want to thank you for presenting today and sharing the anatomy of a CDP. Those were some great questions from everyone, and thanks for giving us your answers and your expertise on the subject. So I will be following up with everybody, but I wanted to thank you, Glenn, for being the presenter and for everybody who attended today.
Thank you very much for having me. And if there will be any questions, you can find me on LinkedIn or yeah, that would be the best place actually.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
I'll send all the recap and a link to your LinkedIn in those emails as well.
Perfect.
All right.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye.